Hello, everybody. I'm here with Caleb for the next chapter in Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. We are doing lecture 18 today. The title is simply Philosophy. So, let's begin. This chapter, what did you think generally? Like out of 10?
It's probably 8 out of 10.
8 out of 10. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
8 out of 10 is good. Yeah. It's not, it's kind of like the it in some ways feels like the conclusion of a lot of different threads that have gone through the book so far. How would you compare it to the Values of Saintliness chapter, though?
I think Values of Saintliness was a better chapter, but I think this kind of ties down and resolves a lot of the things that he's been talking about in the book. So I think the Values of Saintliness was really where he's hitting his peak and talking about the most important stuff, and this is where he's resolving a lot of important ideas. So I think the Values of Saintliness was probably a 9 out of 10 kind of chapter. Very good, very solid, but this is definitely up there in the top 2 or 3 chapters.
And he's teasing other deeper things in Values of Saintliness.
Yeah.
I've been watching these videos on Jung's book Aeon. It is so weird. The people he just says these things like they make sense. Well, right now we're in the age of Pisces, but why are there 2 fish instead of 1? Well, one of them is the Antichrist, and this is just laid on you, you're supposed to get it.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe Jung will do Jung eventually.
Eventually, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, that sounds deep scary. Yeah, it was actually there was a moment I watched a video and then I went, oh, that's scary, when I was watching some of these Jung videos. Yeah. What did he say? Oh yeah, if we forget to integrate something, we will become total shadows. And I'm like,
okay.
Yeah, oh shoot. Okay.
Wow.
Also, this YouTube channel I found is the only YouTube channel that's done Jordan Peterson analysis of Tool songs. Yeah, so now it's my favorite YouTube channel.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. Okay. How do we start?
Let's just hop right in.
Yeah.
He starts off talking about the importance of feeling in religion, about philosophy being a secondary function, a secondary aspect, and basically the philosophy would not arise without the initiation of the emotion or the feeling of something religious. So the philosophy is trying to explain something that exists, but it's not something that would naturally arise absent of feeling, which kind of bumps up against the very the apologetic William Lane Craig that you'd find now, where it's very doing Aristotle and Aquinas to try to do proofs of the existence of God. And he says, hey, if you didn't have the sense of something greater, if you didn't have the sense of there being a deity that interacted with the world, then you would have no compulsion to even philosophize about the subject or the idea of there being a God. So it's following the breadcrumbs and the hints of religious feelings and sentiments.
And he, the next episode of the Will to Believe series that I'm doing is this chapter, Is Life Worth Living? And he talks about religious philosophy in there a little bit too, or natural theology. And he says for many ages, it was the sort of security of highly intellectual people, the security for the faith of highly intellectual people. So people are born into a faith and then they venture into kind of intellectual world where they're encouraged to doubt things. And then they use natural theology to kind of protect themselves, kind of it is their shield. It is in place of the shield of faith for them, right? Against the arrows of doubt, right? And they try to build it, but it ends up falling down because it is itself a human construction. So that's what he says is we're kind of past the point of natural theology just functioning as its own tower in the world or its own construction. It's kind of fallen, he says. Yeah, and I tend to agree. I mean, this is one of the reasons I like James so much, is because the way that he develops ideas is like my own personal history, like the way that I thought through these ideas myself and came to my own beliefs. So it is an important thing. It's that you can't just be he talks a lot about, you can't just be coerced to believe something by an idea as simply as you think you could just by logic. So
Yeah.
like, and he actually says if that's the case, you're denying free will if you say, well, if you believe this, you must believe this, right? But if somebody doesn't follow, if their mind doesn't flow from A to B as naturally as you'd want them to, you're not able to coerce their minds with your logic. In a way, that's persuasion is a form of getting other people to do what you want through rhetoric or logic or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, but the important thing that he has here is that it's a secondary function. It's not useless.
Yeah.
Philosophy is not useless. It's a secondary function. And even if it's not going to be the foundation of your faith, it still has purposes, good purposes, that we want to get into. So yeah, and he has this quote: "The philosophic climate of our time inevitably forces its own clothing on us." So yeah, no duh. The early church fathers talked a lot about Plato, and then when Aristotle became available to Aquinas, he talked a lot about that. And then when scientific data became available to modern apologists, they're using that to back up their claims, as if like treating philosophy as if it's finished, and then its finished project points to their further finished project of theology.
Yeah.
You know, but neither of them are perfect projects.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Yeah, philosophy is typically used like to like, or in the cases that he's talking about, of confirming your original presuppositions and less on like changing one's own like ideas or beliefs, or changing other people's ideas or beliefs. It's a lot more about like confirming or giving yourself like some kind of foundation, or trying to build some kind of foundation other than on faith.
Yeah, I'd maybe push back on that, but we'll move a little bit forward because I do have other thoughts about that. But so the purpose of it that he does propose for us is in the next section, where he goes, he says, intellectualism professes to escape subjective standards in her theological constructions. So the whole book so far, he's talked about individual people's experiences, and in a sense, their right to believe that those things are real, and the in fact goodness of believing that those things are real. But the issue comes in when we want to sort of get other people on board with the fact that we saw Jesus in the sky or something like that, which is the hurdle that you have to jump over. That's the hurdle that most people won't jump over. Now, C.S. Lewis's classic argument against this was, well, I've never seen New York, but people tell me about it, so I believe it, you know. But you might want to go beyond that, where only one person has claims to have seen this, something like this, or 3 women in the garden claim to have seen the gardener, or something like that. So
yeah, it's a big problem to overcome these like very mysterious personal experiences that can't be verified with by an outsider with their senses. And so it's like, it's a lot to overcome, going from like a personal experience to like a universal like theology or like philosophy. So you've got a lot of like kind of strange data that you have to find commonalities for to build something like pretty big and universal.
But that is the goal of philosophy, is to turn those experiences, which in the mysticism chapter we said are basically ineffable, you can't describe them, try to turn them into semi-describable phenomena, but not claim to actually describe them. But turn them into something that we can share somehow. Yeah. So, and it's no surprise that, at least in Christianity, the only symbols that people have been able to use to represent, Christ, is the things that he told us to use, the Eucharist. So, yeah. Yeah, but he it's very. I really liked the section where he talked about oh, let me see if I can find it in the text because it was very good. Oh, let me read this. Religious experience, in other words, spontaneously and inevitably engenders myths, superstitions, dogmas, creeds, and metaphysical theologies and criticisms of one set of these by the adherents of another. Of late, impartial classifications and comparisons have become possible, alongside of the denunciation and anathemas by which the commerce between creeds used exclusively to be carried on. We have the beginnings of a science of religion, so called, and if these lectures could ever be accounted a crumb-like contribution to such a science, I should be made very happy. So again, he's working on the Science of Religions project that he's been on for at least 10 years now, or something like that. And he uses this really cool phrase, commerce between creeds. So everyone in their own experiences is building a creed for themselves. And when you're trying to enter into a religious community or enter into some kind of higher union with one another, you have to have some kind of commerce between these creeds. So where does mine fit with yours? Where does yours fit with mine? And where can we agree? Where can we disagree? And where can we change ourselves to agree?
Yeah.
Is really the goal, is partially the goal of the philosophy. So, oh, and he mentions philosophy as idolatry here too, where people will set up the philosophies, will claim that their philosophies capture God or something like that, and they try to set them up as such. But I'm looking for a particular thing. I should have tried to find it before. I think I passed it. But he essentially says, well, people are always complaining about how divisive all these subjective experiences are, where I want this and you feel that, and I want this and you want that. And so the goal is we're going to use philosophy, and we're going to use philosophy to bring those people together. And then he says, well, but look at the history of philosophy, because it's divided people just as much as the private experiences have. So you haven't really gotten over the problem of
Yeah.
of people disagreeing, because their ultimate belief is not founded on the systems that are coercing the people. Sometimes the people have something that the system has to serve for them to acquiesce to it, which I think is what love is, but we can get into that later.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Like if the philosophical system is the king or something like that, or is the principality that's trying to manifest itself,
Okay.
it has to serve the people's individual experiences somehow. It has to relate to them practically somehow. So the fact that one person can see a system as perfectly related to them and then go, well, this works for me, it should work for everyone, right? The fact that they can feel that about a system and set up their idol like that and think that it's going to solve the problem of division between people's personal experiences, they're mistaken.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's like violence and warfare between creeds as opposed to commerce between creeds that he talks about.
Not finding commonalities or acquiescing or trying to have some kind of unity. I also thought it was interesting that he talks about how the intellectualism in religion typically does not allow for possible or probable truth. And that reminded me of the Will to Believe chapter that you did when going through James's essays. And he talked about how the one guy, I think it was Clifford, wanted to like have perfect certainty with everything, perfect scientific certainty with everything. And James talks about how that can't be the standard that you use to like live your life. You would never get on a boat because you could never be 100% certain that it wouldn't sink and kill you. Does that make sense what I'm trying to connect?
No. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So like, but typically a dogmatic creed doesn't leave room for uncertainty, or maybe God is this way, maybe he's that way.
Yeah.
Well, Western creeds do.
Yeah. It's not loose, vague, or indeterminate.
No, they typically don't leave room for it. Or typically the phrase that gets used is, well, I think this is typically more in Protestant circles and maybe sometimes in Catholic circles, where they'll have a creed or something like that, and they say beyond that, it's conscience.
Yeah.
Right. And that saying beyond that is conscience is their way of saying the
It's gotta
rest
be
there
like,
is truth, but it's loose, vague, and indeterminate.
mhm.
Yeah. But if conscience is split over one issue, it can split a church, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because like some of the videos that Paul Vanderklay have been making have been on the CRC's issue with gay marriage, and so part of the issue is not just what do we believe on it, because it's not in their creed. I don't think. I don't know. I don't want to say something like that, but it's not just of what are we going to believe about this. It's also, do we consider it a issue that's going to separate us or not?
Yeah. Is it central enough doctrine that breaking it or being split on it is enough to split the church? Is this something that you can be in communion together and have differences of conscience on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about this with like the history of libertarian movements in the United States, and a lot of them, like Rothbard, would like enter into a place and with his like personal energy convince people of this grand system, and then when he came into like a small disagreement with someone, it would shatter again, and then two systems would like
Merge.
split off from
Yeah.
one another. Two philosophies would split off from one another.
Mhm.
So one person's personal individual like experiences and energy and ability to communicate created some larger groups, but the fact that he had a vision of an overarching philosophy didn't actually unify the group.
Yeah.
It just caused more splinter groups.
Yeah. I think James is right in using like universal or almost universal acceptance as it should be the standard for philosophy. If it's like the like base for like a religion, and it's not like living up to that, where you should be, people like William Lane Craig will talk about how like all you need is these like 5 little arguments and you can get your way to Christianity through like philosophy. And he'll do debates in front of thousands of people and maybe change a couple people's minds, but like if his logical reasoning was, or logical system was so pure and like well constructed, it should be like convincing everyone if it's just pure logic, but it's not that,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah, or it's if even it is logic, but it's not
Yeah.
coercive for some reason.
Yeah.
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 So he goes through the next section. He goes through all those arguments, like the kinds that William Lane Craig goes through: cosmological argument from design, moral argument, which I realize I don't think he really addresses that much. Moral argument,
He doesn't really.
which I think it's because he kind of believes it, maybe. But that's the one that I would have most affinity for now. Or later what Kant called the transcendental argument, but that wasn't even necessarily transcendental argument for God's existence. It was just the transcendental argument, which there's a lot. Okay, that's one of the things about this chapter that definitely isn't makes it less interesting, is there's a lot of Kant and Hegel like griping. And that's something that you got to know about James too, is he saw his big philosophical opponents at the time were people like Josiah Royce, who was like the American Hegelian, the guy that like brought Hegel to America and made it a big deal. So, and he was in a department with Josiah Royce, and they competed with one another. But they were more like rivals, like friendly rivals in philosophy.
Yeah.
And if you read a lot of other of James's works, especially Pragmatism, he mentions Royce a lot. Yeah. So the stuff about Kant and Hegel is definitely like the soup that he was swimming in, in their department at Harvard, and that's why he's thinking about it so much. But yeah. So he goes. Darwin obviously was a major blow to the argument for design, the way that people normally think about the argument for design. And the cosmological argument, it's based on like too fluffy of an idea. Like the logic works. I don't know if you've ever heard like a formal version of the cosmological argument.
Yeah. I've heard it a couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like all things that exist have a cause. The universe exists, therefore it has a cause, and it needs like to have a cause outside of itself, and so that causes God. It's the
Well, it's
uncause.
not you made the first premise wrong, and that's actually that's where most people get is they go, oh well, all things have a cause, then what caused God,
Yeah.
right? But what you're supposed to say is all caused things require a cause. The universe is caused, therefore the
Gotcha.
universe has a cause.
Yeah.
So, and then someone will go, well, was the universe caused? Why can't the universe cause itself? Why isn't the universe a necessary thing? And then somebody will try to get into science, or like, oh well, look, like water flows and like things melt, and you go, what? So, even if it's like true in some very strict logical sense, we're only going to know in what way it's true at the end of time when Jesus comes back anyway.
Yeah.
So, whatever that means for Jesus to come back.
Yeah.
That's kind of the point. Okay, you've noted here that there's a good footnote about order and disorder.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that right now.
Yeah, what page is that on?
So when you read it and talk about page numbers, it does not show up the same when I read it.
Oh,
And
really?
so I try to avoid putting page numbers in my comments so that I don't like.
Oh, yeah, okay. I found it.
Yeah, it's on 428 for me.
438 for me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll read it, I guess.
Okay.
It must not be forgotten that any form of disorder in this world, I remember this, in the world might, by the design argument, suggest a God for just that kind of disorder. The truth is that any state of things whatever that can be named is logically susceptible of teleological interpretation. The ruins of the earthquake at Lisbon, for example, the whole of past history had to be planned exactly as it was to bring about in the fullness of time just that particular arrangement of debris, of masonry, furniture, and once living bodies. No other train of causes would have been sufficient. And so of any other arrangement, bad or good, which might as a matter of fact be found resulting anywhere from the previous conditions, to avoid such pessimistic consequences and save its beneficent designer, the design argument accordingly invokes two other principles restrictive in their operation. The first is physical. Nature's forces tend of their own accord only to disorder and destruction, to heaps of ruins, not to architecture. This principle, though plausible at first sight, seems in the light of recent biology to be more and more improbable. The second principle is one of anthropomorphic interpretation. No arrangement that for us is disorderly can possibly have been an object of design at all. This principle is, of course, a mere assumption in the interests of anthropomorphic theism. So what he's saying is, people say, oh, look at us. How could something as unlikely as us just show up randomly? Oh, well, God must have set it up that way. And I think that the phrase anthropomorphic theism is very interesting. And I made a note. I said, what about a theological anthropology? Which is, I think, closer to what Christianity is it's a interpretation of humans as already divine things, not thinking there's divine things and then putting human characteristics onto them.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's very interesting. And so this is very a Jamesian way to talk about it, because he's just kind of saying, he's not saying that the arguments didn't work in the past, or that there was nothing there. He's not saying there's anything particularly wrong with them, but certain premises, even if they are true, they're just not living options right now. So the future of religion is probably not, these things are not going to be the major players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it kind of shows how what for even like centuries could be a very living option as a premise can, one day change radically in its ability to be a living option. Like the idea that this nature tends towards disorder and so therefore destruction. So something that is ordered has to be caused by, or has to be designed by something that's ordering something.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Darwin and showing how things can tend towards order in genetic development, it kind of pulls a lot of the power out of that statement pretty quickly. And so something that was, a strong principle for centuries becomes pretty weakened in like a decade after Darwin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
Nassim Taleb has a little, actually a book on things that last long, typically gain from disorder. It's a book called Anti-Fragile. It's definitely worth checking out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he starts to talk about is this when he cites the entire like 3 pages of a philosophy textbook? Yeah, he just cites like 3 pages of some Catholic philosophy textbook, and they just go through like the supreme being is ultimately simple, and this means this, and this means this, and this means this. I think it's by John Henry Newman, who wrote a famous book that gets used a lot in Catholic circles called The Idea of a University. So a lot of people, when they say like, what is the purpose of a university as an institution in the world, what is its mission, they'll cite John Henry Newman, at least Catholics will. But he obviously liked theology.
Yeah.
And Catholic theology. But yeah, he cites it here too as well. But yeah. And he kind of, so he says, you can do a logic like this, and let's just assume the logic works. Like your premises, your conclusions follow from your premises. I'm not going to doubt that for the time period. Because, but what is the purpose of it? What is the point of doing something like that? If you have to abstract the God that you're talking about so much that it's beyond practical use, then what am I supposed to care about it,
Yeah. I think that's what he hits pretty hard, is like a lot of the stuff that the guy was breaking down was a lot of stuff that really has no appreciable difference on, or should bear no appreciable difference on how you should live your life. Now, some of the things do show up, like God's omniscience and God's quality as a judge. Like those combined will have an appreciable difference on how you live. So God being omniscient or not omniscient will change how you behave. But yeah, a lot of the things that the guy listed off, like his simplicity, doesn't really have any tangible way of affecting how someone lives their life.
The way that I was going to push back against that is that maybe they might have meaning in an intermediate sense. So, let's get to the next set. Let's do the next section, because that's when I want to talk about it after that. Because, so he says, he basically pulls out his toolbox and he says, hey, let's use pragmatism on this. And he cites Peirce to talk about pragmatism here, which, by the way, I've read mostly William James and not Peirce, probably just because William James is easier to read. But Peirce might be like the real genius, because he writes these things. I read an essay by him last summer called last summer, called Evolutionary Love, and it was so bizarre, but I remember agreeing with it, but I don't even know what it said. But he went through these stages where he's like, well, evolution is either completely random, or it's like mechanical, or it's the love of God, and that's what it is. And then he was like, and I was like, yeah, I agree. And he's like, so obviously that's how it is. But in the middle of the essay, he has this sense where he goes, Lamarckian evolution is evolution by brute force. And then immediately after that, he goes, that's a stupid sentence. The only reason I wrote it is because there was a person standing behind me who I'm pretty sure is appointed to be an annoyer in society. And then he just continues writing the essay. But he just complains about somebody annoying him while he's writing his essay in the essay. And it gets published.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah, because he was James's, like, he's slightly older than James, and he was friends with him when James was a medical student. But he was really bad socially, and he could never hold a job anywhere. I think he held a job at Johns Hopkins for the longest period, but he ended up basically being homeless for like most of his life. And there's like a famous story of William James is like in a horse and carriage, like in Boston or whatever, and some guys like somebody runs up to the carriage, and then the carriage boy is like, "Oh, there's like a vagabond running up to the carriage." He's like, "Should I get rid of him?" And then William James like, "Oh, that's Charles Burt. Let him in. He like me. That guy made my career." And so then he lets him in and gives him like a house. But he did cocaine too.
Oh,
Yeah.
man.
And he was some kind of theist though. I don't know. Peirce is a whole different story. And
It's worth checking out.
he did not like what James did with pragmatism either. And
Oh, really?
what he did is he said he wanted to reformulate it, and he called it pragmatism, which he said is a name that is so ugly that no one would want to steal it. So he wanted to make a philosophy that no one else wanted to like co-opt.
Oh my gosh.
So Peirce will be the only pragmaticist.
That's great.
Yeah. But he's still considered the founder of pragmatism.
Huh.
But he's a funny guy. Yeah. I really need to read the Metaphysical Club soon, because that's a full. I've read a biography of James, but the Metaphysical Club, which I think I have right here, maybe no I don't, is a full history of the pragmatist movement or the pragmatist revolution. But anyway, okay, yeah, I just read the word pragmatism and I said all that. So okay, we've got these finished products. So it's like, imagine all these theologians, they do their like tinkering in their heads in their workshops, and they come out to you with these finished, full, like majestic systems of philosophy, and then they put them all on the table in front of you, and then you're supposed to go, okay, well, which one am I going to believe, right? And so the pragmatist says, well, look at each one of them, and the meaning of that system is ultimately in what practical uses it has for you. So you go to the first guy and you go, okay, so give me the gist of your system. And he's like, well, I started from just, basic observations about nature and the patterns of bird flights. And I figured out that God is orange, and his favorite TV show is Glee. And so you go, okay, thank you. And you move on to the next one, because that means nothing to you,
Yeah.
like what color God is, or what his favorite TV show is, or how he likes his steak or something like that. Maybe that has something to do with sacrifices. If you're going to sacrifice to that God, you need to know how he likes his steak. But then the next guy is like, gives you like the classical Thomism, or somebody gives you Calvin, or somebody gives you this, or somebody gives you that, all the different sets. Somebody gives you Islam, somebody gives you Hinduism. That was James' big beef with Hinduism, is that he thought that it didn't really mean very much either. But the way that you're going to judge them, if you're just a person that has to look at all these systems, is what do they mean to me practically? Or that is the lines that you're going to judge them on. If I'm going to be orthodox, okay, then I need to figure out what it means to believe this thing. It means that I'm going to actually pine for the Eucharist in some way. I'm going to desire it. Or if I truly am going to believe it, that's going to be a change in my life. And that's something that I need to realize is what it means to believe that thing in the first place.
Yeah.
If you really do believe that you need to imitate Jesus and be saved by imitating Jesus, then you have to realize that this means you're going to have to self-sacrificially love people all over. These are very, very practical things. And so that's James's conclusion, is that a lot of the more abstract attributes of God are more meaningless than the more concrete ones, like that he loves everyone, or that he sees everything, or that he can do anything. I mean, he's just kind of picking the obvious ones, but he says that this is something that you should look at when you're looking at a philosophy. If this is how we're going to divine the meaning of a philosophy, if not its truth in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So, and he ultimately ends up saying, yeah, the moral parts of God are the moral attributes are typically the more practical ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you saying about the more abstract qualities acting as like intermediate
Yeah.
intermediaries?
I mean, in the sense that like the divine simplicity is very important to Catholic theology. I don't know how, but it is very, very important to them. And if you like that you have to think of God that way, or else you're not exactly thinking of him properly. And I don't know how, but they emphasize it for more of a reason than the simple fact that like it's just like a conclusion of some logical progression.
Yeah.
And they actually see it as what binds together the system, or it's what makes the Trinity not fall apart in some ways. That's something that you hear a lot of in councils, right? I think that the fact that the councils are reactions to heresies is really, really close to what's going on here, because the point of the church councils then is you only venture into using a theological solution when there's a potential that it's going to rip apart the community.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you're taking down false ideas that are tearing apart or having some kind of tangible effect and problem on your existing community, and so you're using your theological knowledge to kind of parse together and kind of patch over the differences that ever have arisen, and like try to bring everyone back to this common center where everyone's got some kind of shared belief.
That's like, I'd call that more like restorative theology used to restore,
Yeah.
rather than, and restore preservative or conservative theology rather than speculative theology.
Yeah. You're not doing theology to like understand the world like coming from like no knowledge except for, and just going off of like a priori like axioms or something. You're starting from your religion, your understanding of theology, and you're using that to like retain the cohesion of your idea, your belief. I think that makes sense.
And the reaction to heresy is not just something like a heresy shows up, so we need to get rid of it. It's more, a heresy shows up, so we need to clarify what we already believe in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really good. You've got a note here that there's a good footnote on God's justice.
Yeah. I like the and just a point before that note, the bit on the book of Job standing in opposition to rationalizing God's morality was such an interesting point, because it was, the whole point of that book was saying we can't understand God, the nature of God's goodness. We, like, Job is not worthy and not able to understand God, but he still like loves God and trusts God despite not knowing what's going on. And it's just in complete opposition to the rationalizing your way through all your theology. Is this one, Job starts from a place of faith, and from there realizes that he can't rationalize his understanding of God, instead of trying to rationalize his understanding of God's goodness, and because of that rationalization, then coming to some certain understanding of God. Because like Job's rationalized understanding of God's goodness stood in opposition to like what had happened. It was like massive meaning when Peterson talks about like you're someplace, you have a map, and then like something knocks you out of like the system that you thought you were in. And so Job thought God operated one way, and then something happened that made him believe God wasn't operating that way. And so it made him doubt the good qualities of God, and then he comes to realize that he can only like understand God's goodness through faith, and he can't do that by his ration and reason alone. And it was just very, very different from what you would, hear at your typical apologetics camp.
You shouldn't stand on your theology. Your theology should stand on the
faith.
truth, which lets itself known if it's truly true.
Yeah.
So, and that reminds me of Pascal too, because Pascal was, in a sense, the first person to react to the Enlightenment, because he was friends with Descartes, and he read Descartes' things, and then he went like, "Oh, this is awful," and I don't know if he had some kind of crisis of faith, but he had this famous Night of Fire where he wrote this really good prayer, and then he at some point he wrote in his pensées in his collection of his notes, basically, that has become a book. He says one thing, that the scriptures never use philosophy, almost ever. The only time that I can really think of it is like kind of Ecclesiastes, but that doesn't use philosophy to build up someone's faith. That's actually, it's almost like to tear down their faith in the world. So that's a worldly thing versus a worldly thing. Mm-hmm. Philosophy versus the world, and it succeeds. But the ending of Ecclesiastes is not, it's not non-philosophical, but it's not a strict logical philosophy.
It's not using your premises to come to conclusion. And the footnote that I was mentioning, it was pragmatically the most important attribute of God is his punitive justice, but who in the present state of theological opinion on that point will dare maintain that hellfire or its equivalent is in some shape rendered certain by pure logic? Theology herself has largely based this doctrine upon revelation, and in discussing it has tended more and more to substitute conventional ideas of criminal law for a priori principles of reason. But the very notion that this glorious universe with planets and winds and laughing sky and ocean should have been conceived and had its beams and rafters laid in technicalities of criminality is incredible to our modern imagination. It weakens a religion to hear it argued upon such a basis.
What is he talking about? Calvinism there?
Partially, maybe, but I don't think so. I think he's talking about the idea of having hell, and so there being some kind of punitive justice for our actions. And so if there is some kind of punishment or cost imposed on us because of how we act in this world, then that is a strong reason to act differently in this world. And so he's, at least at the beginning, he starts talking about how you wouldn't presuppose or logic your way to the idea of there being a hell. And and so if you can't logic your way to having hell, then why, like, that's one of the most important things pragmatically for him. And so doesn't see the importance
that God might cut himself off from you eternally is practical.
Incredibly important for how you live your life. And if you can't derive that from pure logic, and that's one of the most important things pragmatically, then why would you lean so heavily on pure logic in other places, I guess?
Mm-hmm. That's
really interesting.
And so a lot of the rest of this is about Kant and Hegel, and it's boring. And I guess he's giving examples of people of the modern he's like, scholastic theology is dead. People are trying Hegelian religious philosophy, and he says, and I think the conclusion of this is another set of meaninglessness, and it's going to die.
Yeah.
And I mean, who do you hear talk about Hegel anymore nowadays? No one.
People still talk about Kant, though.
Yeah, but nobody's read it.
Yeah.
I mean, like in the sense, like people thought like this is going to take on like a religious level, you know,
Yeah.
like it's going to be the replacement religion.
Of religion? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that really the current general faith that people have is a semi-political enlightenment religion mixed with like splintered off Protestantism that they don't realize is Christianity in America.
Yeah.
Like they have a lot of sentiments that they don't recognize as Christian but are very Christian, and then strong senses of that being applied politically.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true or that's proper. So
Yeah.
yeah, the one phrase that we did not mention that I want to bring up, oh, my computer's shutting down, but it's the phrase about optics. Can you find it? The science of optics.
Let's see if I can Control F.
Yeah, it's something like
The science of optics has to be fed in the first instance and continually verified later by facts experienced by seeing persons. So the science of religion would depend for its original material on facts of personal experience and would have to square itself with personal experience throughout all its critical reconstructions. It could never get away from concrete life or work in a conceptual vacuum.
But where's the part of the blind man? I think that might be before that.
I don't. It's probably okay. Even the personally non-religious might accept its conclusions on trust, such as a blind person now accepts the fact of optics. It might appear foolish to refuse them.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the science of optics has to be fed in some first instance and continually verified later by facts experienced by seeing persons.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Religious philosophy can be a genuine, what do you call it?
Philosophical endeavor, science.
Or like a genuine carriage of truth from one person to another, from a person that was the primary experiencer, and then it can operate as a conduit. Conduit's a good word.
Yeah.
And so, but in with respect to optics, most people can see and blind people can't see. But so we come up with ideas about optics and how vision works and how light works based on the way that we see it and our experiences with it. And then we can describe it to a blind person and they might be able to make use of it in their own way and be part of the community of believers in the science of optics, right? But in the real world, it's flipped and most people are blind. Most people aren't having direct experiences of the divine in some way.
Yeah.
Whatever that means. What most people would not write diaries that James would cite in volume 2 of this work.
Yeah.
Yeah. But and that is like the first quote from this book I read, because I think when I got it, I just opened it up to a random page and I got and I saw that and I was like, boom. And I think that's on my website as a quote under the William James section of quotes.
The science of optics part?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's his conclusion of there is an incredibly practical use to philosophy, but it also has to be judged practically. So then you ask yourself the question, okay, of any of those philosophies, which one can the blind man like get any practical use out of? Not the one that, helps you see better, but maybe the one that helps you understand how other people see better, or maybe it's not a perfect philosophy then, but like, I don't know, what parts of the science of optics could a blind person make use of is an important thing.
It is an important question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
Not sure
Yeah.
either.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about Kant at all, but yeah, the gist of it is he's not that convinced. I think. I don't. Maybe he is. I don't know.
Yeah.
But okay, we only have 2 chapters left.
Yeah.
Very
Almost
good.
there.
It's about 60 pages left. Wow.
Yeah. We could probably knock it out in the next week or two.
Probably can. And everybody else will be along for the ride. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.